Hello, my name is Shannon French, and I am the Inamori Professor in Ethics at Case Western Reserve University, where I also direct the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. I'm here to talk to you today about my field, which is a subfield of philosophy and a subfield of ethics, and that is military ethics. I've been working in this field for quite a long time, and I find that it's an inexhaustible topic. Probably everyone feels that way about their particular subfield or specialty, but I'm going to try to convince you that it's definitely true of military ethics, because one thing that I am very passionate about is encouraging more people to get into this field, because we need as many minds as possible working on these topics. So when you think about military ethics, I want you to think about there being two main branches of this broader topic. One, which we use the Latin phrase jus ad bellum for, is the focus of trying to understand why nations go to war and when it is just or ethical to do so. So that entire part of military ethics is focused on a bit more of a macro scale, trying to understand the movement of nations and the politics and the policies that go into that decision to commit troops to a combat situation. Now, when you're looking at just war theory in this way, you're looking at a broad tradition, a tradition of just war that goes all the way back as far as we have written records. Because as soon as humans started recording things, unfortunately, they seem to have recorded war. It seems to be pretty deep in our nature to have conflict with one another and to feel that the only way to resolve that conflict may be through violence. But happily, the reason that military ethics comes into the picture is that we've also learned, perhaps through the bitter experience, that using violence to solve problems often just begets more violence and more problems. And so the just war tradition grows out of an attempt, we hope an honest and authentic attempt, to put up barriers so that it is harder or less likely to reach the threshold of actually committing people to the awful thing that is war. So when you look at this aspect of military ethics, you can go back through a list of criteria that have been studied and refined through centuries, actually through millennia, that help us try to put up those barriers, that ask questions like, before you take anyone to war, do you have the legitimate authority to do so? You may be rich enough to, in medieval times, for example, gather up a bunch of knights under your banner, but do you really have any authority, and especially any moral authority, to command them to go off and take lives in the name of some mission that you've chosen? In modern terms, we talk about this right authority in terms of the international community and even international law. How will you be judged as a nation if you commit troops to war? But we also ask some interesting questions around maybe groups that are not as recognized by the international community. What if you are leading a rebellion? What if you are part of an insurgency? Do you also have rights to engage in this thing called war? And where are those lines to be drawn? There's a lot of still unknown areas that we need to refine and explore as an international community, where we are asking ourselves, looking throughout history, have we simply defaulted to the status quo in terms of who we allow to have that authority to declare war? And have we, in fact, used that special authority in ways that are unjust and harmful to world peace and stability? Some of the other criteria are equally ancient, but also have modern day questions that arise. So, for example, last resort. Now, this makes a lot of sense. If you want to say you can't take people into this level of violent conflict unless you've tried everything else. That's the idea behind last resort. It sounds very straightforward until you start to think about, well, hang on, how do I know that I've hit the last resort? And exactly how much do I have to fear or endure before I come to that threshold? Nowadays, with the kind of weapons that we're all too aware of, things that range from, of course, nuclear weapons, but also chemical, biological, maybe weapons we haven't even heard of yet, we can now ask even more disturbing questions. Will I know when I've reached the last resort? Will I know when my enemy is about to attack? We live in a world now where attacks may come through cyberspace. And how will we know that they are on their way until they have perhaps wreaked havoc in some form or another? But remember, these criteria are there to try to stop or slow down the process towards war. So the hope is that the bar is pretty high for last resort, that you should have a strong push to try to find some other way to resolve whatever conflict you are in before you resort to war. And one of the strongest reasons for that is that there has never been a war in which innocents did not die. And so before we commit that act, that crime, as some would say, or the evil that is war, we have to truly ask, have we tried everything else? But I will throw one more twist in there. As we ask that question, we do have to be honest about the costs of the alternatives. Because in some cases, the military ethicist like me is going to throw a wrench in the works by saying, you don't want to go to war for good reasons, but your alternative that you've chosen is, let's say, sanctions. Have you looked at what they do? Have you looked at whether the alternative to war that you've chosen is in fact actually targeting the most vulnerable people in the population that they are directed against? So that in fact, what sounded like a more humane choice is perhaps not, and might in fact be one that leads to greater and lasting harms. We can't assume, and so we have to challenge and question and always force ourselves to look at everyone who will have impact from this decision. Well, so these are some of the criteria. We could keep going with the list that has been with us through this tradition. Everything from righteous intention, for example, which asks us to really want the end of this conflict to be better than whatever got us into the conflict. So that we must ask ourselves questions not just of why we're going to war, but what the ultimate peace will look like. Are we building justice? Are we building a more stable world? Or are we just destabilizing everything further and again building up more trouble, storing trouble for ourselves in the future? These are the kind of questions we still have to ask today whenever we decide whether or not to get into a conflict. And all of these are still questions within this general area of whether or not you should go to war. And they also include questions about whether you can succeed and how many people will be lost in the effort and whether that makes sense. But there was, as I mentioned, another area. The other focus area that military ethics must also explore is called jus in bello. And this is looking at justice within war, or the just conduct of war. Looking at the just conduct of war has many variations today because, again, of evolution in war tactics, in weaponry. And yet the questions that we must ask are themselves quite timeless. And we can often look to the past to get the guidance that we need. In some ways, even though war changes, the fundamentals stay the same. And there's really nothing new under the sun if you look for the right analog to something from the past, to today's marvelous new technologies. But if you're trying to conduct a just war, you have to use just means. And that includes asking yourselves, what weapons are the right weapons to use? Who should you be targeting with these weapons? Who should you be taking prisoner? And how should you treat them if you have taken them into your control like that? What about abuses that we are familiar with that come up on our splashy news reports? Things about the terrible treatment of prisoners or torture to try to extract information. Are these always out of bounds, or are they only out of bounds in certain circumstances? Some of the most rigid just war tradition lessons try to revolve around lines that should never be crossed, that there are some things that are always wrong, and it doesn't matter how extreme the situation is or how much is at stake, that some things can never be done. We even use the expression in speaking of certain weapons, for example. We call them mal in se, meaning they are basically evil in themselves and should never be used, even if they could help speed the end of the war. But as we look at these questions of just conduct, we are asking questions about the activities of real life, breathing, feeling human beings who have to live with the consequences of the choices that we're asking them to make. So if we ask them to make determinations, blithely called discrimination between possible targets, what we're really talking about is asking them to live with decisions to shoot or not shoot a particular other human being. And those decisions will always be complicated by other aspects of our ethics and our psychology. So, for example, nowadays, as in the past, we always have people in harm's way in a conflict who did not have a choice to be part of that conflict. Interestingly, sometimes those are people who are actually combatants. So they were conscripted or drafted into the conflict and would not have chosen to fight on the side that they are. And yet, because they constitute a direct threat, they are seen as valid and fair targets to direct fire against, to try to kill. But on the other hand, we also have people who are caught up in the conflict by virtue of where they live, or are given no choice or option but to remain in danger zones. And then we have weapons that remain even after the conflict is over, landmines left behind that can injure innocents who are left in harm's way for a conflict that may have been ended years or even decades ago. All of this is to say that the people in danger in a war include the combatants that fight against one another, but tend to include the whole population as well. And in a lot of modern conflicts, determining who is a combatant and who is not is no easy matter. We're pretty far from the days where two armies would line up on an actual chosen battlefield and shoot at one another from a prescribed distance. We don't have that so much, and in fact, what we mostly have are conflicts that end up right in people's literal backyards, fighting in urban areas and in crowded and confusing scenarios where people have to make decisions that will, again, be with them their whole lives. Sadly, there are other aspects that complicate jus in bello, things such as the use of child soldiers. How do you respond if someone raises a weapon against you in a conflict zone? Someone you would normally not hesitate to shoot if you were a combatant and they were a combatant, and this was within the context of a just war. And yet you look at that fellow combatant and see that they are a mere child. Their weapon is real. The threat to you is real. And yet we would normally, as ethical individuals, hesitate to direct deadly violence against someone who cannot consent to be part of that endeavor simply by virtue of their age. In ethics, we talk about the category of moral patience for children who are too young to even consent to these kinds of activities. And yet there you are, faced with that innocent threat that is nevertheless a threat. We also have questions when we look at today's modern jus in bello, where we have to wonder what is right on the horizon. And there's a lot of exciting work to be done here, because we now know that we are right on the edge of incorporating more and more machines into warfare. Now, again, this is nothing new. In some sense, there have always been tools and machines and weapons involved in warfare. But the increased intimacy with machines is something somewhat new, and we do need to take our time to understand exactly what it will mean if we allow, for example, machines to autonomously make decisions about who lives and who dies. On the other hand, perhaps we can use machines in ways that will keep us more ethical. that will help us to determine more accurately who is and is not a true threat, or maybe provide medical support in ways that are too dangerous for regular human beings. There are good and bad things that come along with every technology. And as I mentioned earlier, looking for analogs in the past can be very helpful. But the hard work is taking the principles of the past, things like proportionality. Am I using the right amount of force to respond to the threat? And applying them to modern questions like a cyber attack. If someone attacks me through cyberspace, can I respond with a kinetic attack? In other words, can I bomb them or attack them in some other way that causes actual damage in the physical world? Does it depend on whether their cyber attack caused physical damage in my side of the world or not? All of these questions need to be answered, and they need to be answered both in the realm of ethics, drawing on the principles that we use in other contexts, everything from Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, trying to find the correct balance of views and principles. And then we also have to figure out where the hard lines are that we can establish into fixed international law. Norms need to be built and laws need to be established, while overarching, we consider always the ethics of the individual. Because at the end of the day, military ethics must also look at what war does to those who fight. And that is another rich and important area of this philosophical subfield. To look at moral injury and to understand how fighting in a war affects those who do the fighting. Thank you.